welcome back to the Vice City Let's Play. I'm Cameron, and with me today is a guest. It's Paul Tamayo.
Hey, what's good, everybody?
Now, Paul, when I asked you to be on the show, joining many illustrious guests, you said, "Oh yeah, great, this is not exactly the words you used, but you said, "Oh yeah, great, excellent. I love Vice City."
Yeah, all caps.
All caps. It's very good. Let me do it. When are we doing it? And I said, okay, gosh, hold your horses. Let's wait. But no, yeah. So tell me about Vice City. Tell me about Grand Theft Auto. Where are you with the franchise? How did you enjoy it as a child? Because I think we're about the same age.
Yeah, I think we're roughly about the same age. So I was born. I don't mind revealing my age. I won't ask you to reveal yours. Mm-hmm. But I was born in '88, so I'm 32. So I remember distinctly my time with GTA 2 on the PlayStation 1 because I think me and my brother, we rented it from Blockbuster just based on the cover alone. And we had always played it like this really fun, arcade game. That's kind of what it was at the time. It was just like this long form arcade game that you could just have a really good time with. And at that time too, I don't know if you remember these games, but you probably do. I think we're about the same age. Mm-hmm. But there was also a series called Driver that was out I think a lot of people don't talk about. That was, it was just a driving game like the title implies. And you were driving around doing different tasks, trying to escape the cops and trying to tail people. So it had a very GTA vibe to it. So these kind of games they were just like very prevalent during that era in particular. And so when GTA 3 came out, I think it was 2001, if I'm not mistaken. I remember it just kind of completely blowing my mind apart into a million pieces because I never thought games could be like that. And like, I know for a lot of folks listening, especially like younger or people watching, a lot of younger viewers might just be like, what are you talking about? This is, it's hard to imagine what that was like. And when Vice City came out, surprisingly enough, a year later, also fantastic driving here, by the way. This is real.
Well, I think this is extremely accurate to the early 2000s driving.
Oh, for sure. Because we were like figuring out how to do 3D, traversal.
Exactly.
On top of that, just like, yeah. So, so then in 2002, when Vice City came out, I remembered it at the time because like the only information I could get from it, especially during that era, was like through EGM or like GamePro, these magazines. So we only saw screenshots and stuff and whatever ads would run on TV or you could find online to download even. So, when this one came out, it completely took over my life as well. I mean, me and my brother, that's all we did. My best friend Cam, who was also my podcast co-host, shout out to Cam, this is like just completely took over our lives. We had posters on our walls of like Lance Vance and whichever ones came inside of the PS2 cases. Mm-hmm. So this was like a cultural phenomenon, and it's interesting now revisiting it in 2020. 18 years later, which is hard to think about. But I played it on PC recently just to kind of brush up and at least play the intro. And one of the things that immediately struck me, the way it did kind of back then, was how star-studded this cast was. Like, I mean, Tommy Vercetti is Ray Liotta.
Yeah.
Like, that was a big deal in 2002. It was like, whoa, video games are like, we're big now. We can afford Hollywood actors.
Yeah, the I'm blanking on the dude's name from Machete.
Danny Trejo.
Yeah, Danny Trejo is the Cuban gang leader who we're gonna see in just a minute. He's gonna be on screen. I'm now shooting Cuban gang members. It's super weird. Well, it's like the money was on the screen in some ways, right? Which I think was part of the like. Well, I guess that is what connects like our adolescent video game experience to like what people have now, right? Like now Cyberpunk comes out and it's like, oh damn, this game is cool because it looks really good. And like we had that too in the sense that we were like, hell yeah, this is the best that graphics are going to be. But it was also like you're saying, Ray Liotta, this huge powerhouse, Goodfellas, right? This crime drama powerhouse dude. he's in the video game, and it's really funny playing it now and like listening, and maybe he recorded 2 days of dialogue, right? Like the number of lines from Ray Liotta are very thin in this game, but also that soundtrack.
Oh my god!
I mean, I don't think I've talked about this on this Let's Play so far, but the soundtrack for Vice City changed my interest in music entirely when I was, early teens.
I'd agree. Yeah.
Because there was a huge amount of music that I'd never heard before. Just a lot of it, I'm sure I'd heard like the dad rock stuff that's on here, certainly like the hair metal and things like that. But a lot of the new wave stuff I'd never heard before. And weirdly enough, I mean, my parents were, 20 years old when they had me. And so weirdly enough, this music was their adolescent music. And so I had a pretty quick and easy connection to like all of this stuff. Like, my mom could listen to it and be like, oh yeah, this was a good album. You should listen to the album. And, I would go to Circuit City an hour away and buy a CD. I'm like saying all these archaic terms that no one's ever heard of anymore. But yeah, I mean, well, so you were enthusiastically saying yes about the music. I mean, anything you picked up from it?
Oh my god, yeah. I mean, especially as a young kid who pretty much only played video games. Video games introduced me to so many different types of music that also I just wasn't familiar with. I grew up I was born and raised in Queens, New York. I had a pretty diverse set of friends growing up, but I mostly, absorbed a lot of hip hop, R&B, that kind of stuff growing up. So, but we also were just kind of exposed to whatever was popular at the time. So whatever was on MTV or whatever, like that's kind of what made its way to us. But it took the likes of Tony Hawk and games like Grind Session and, Grand Theft Auto, all these kind of games that had really incredible soundtracks that would expose us to different genres that we weren't too familiar with. So I also have a very similar upbringing where my parents, they had me when I have two older siblings. So all three of us were born in the 80s. And so we have a very kind of direct connection to the 80s by way of like our parents and our family members and our cousins and our uncles and aunts. So we listened to whatever was popular. But Vice City introduced me to catalogs that like just more of that particular kind of genre. So, funk, R&B, like Fever 105 to me is like the best thing that has ever existed, in my opinion, the best thing to ever come out of a GTA game, period. So yeah, but it also introduced me to things like you were talking about, like that, some of that sort of new wave stuff and things that I would have never been exposed to otherwise. Like some of that hair metal stuff, that was new to me. So, because my parents were like, their interests were all over the place. They were kind of hippie-ish. They also loved disco and that kind of stuff, which kind of naturally led me to just the kind of music that I grew up listening to, which was mostly like funk, again, hip-hop, house music. But yeah, Grand Theft Auto played such a huge, especially this one. I think to date, this might be the game that I've poured the most time into. Like I know every square inch of this map. Because I was just a bored kid, and at that time, my parents, they weren't making a ton of money, so like this was the game that I got, and this was the one that I played a heck of a lot of, and you just get real familiar with it, and the music was just one of those things where I knew it so well that. Oh, very nice strategy here. Very pro strats.
Well, this is maybe my fifth time trying to do this mission. Because this game is hard.
Yeah,
like legitimately, it is difficult to play this video game. And I think that's something that we don't. I mean, maybe it's the youth don't understand. Like I love that we keep saying things like this, but that like the new Grand Theft Auto game is extremely easy compared to these PlayStation 2 Grand Theft Auto games.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was dreading when I booted it up again the other night, just to kind of brush up on it. I was dreading that mini helicopter construction site level that's kind of been notorious. I thankfully did it on the second try. I think 18 years later, my gamer instincts have matured a bit. But this game was tough, man. This game was brutal, and the checkpoints were almost non-existent. You'd have to drive back to the guy whoever gave you the mission and start it all up again and skip through the cutscenes, and it was just very unforgiving. And I think that was just a limitation of how things were at the time, but also how games were just structured in general. Like we were still very much trying to figure this out at that time. Like again, 3D cameras were still a new thing.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting to, like, you know, as I grow older, I end up saying all the things that like all the NES gamers were saying when I was like a late teenager and that I rolled my eyes at. But something I think that is interesting about this is, just like you're saying, that the PlayStation 2 in particular and the big budget games of the PlayStation 2 are such weird fumbling objects. Like, it really is people trying to figure it out. And we treat them, or at the time, right, we treated them as like, you know, scientific proof of like good game design, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's something that's a little bit different, a little bit lost in like the, you know, whatever blockbuster or AAA gaming space right now, is that like in the early 2000s, even at that point, people were not running, you know, elaborate A/B testing on what the best UI decisions were. And things like that. They really do feel, even the biggest games feel weirdly experimental in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think another thing that is, I guess, fascinating to uncover, even though kind of a side tangent, I will say I somehow have a copy of this game on Xbox for the Xbox One. And I bought a Series X thinking like, oh yeah, I'm buying this because one of the main selling points was backwards compatibility. So I figured, oh cool, I could, you know, I have a copy of this laying around, I'll just pop it in and get to playing. It turns out the Xbox doesn't support that in backwards compatibility. So I bought it on Steam, and then I found out that the Steam version requires a little bit of finessing to run the right way and recognize your controller inputs, and the soundtrack has been removed for probably licensing reasons, and there is a way to get the soundtrack back, but I wouldn't do that because I'm a legally abiding citizen. No, law-abiding citizen. Because I would never do that. I would never encourage people to do that and look into that. But it kind of raises the question of like, it's a bummer that it took so much work and effort to play this game. And you know, it's on like mobile devices. You can play it that way, but I typically just really don't like playing any kind of game with touchscreen controls. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's just like the old gamer in me. Like I just need some buttons. I need an analog stick or a D-pad. So you know, that there is that way to do it. I guess you could probably just hook up a controller or whatever. But it's just a shame that it took so much effort to just try to revisit this game, which I consider a classic. Even though, you know, this isn't breaking news by any means, but this game's got a lot of problems. Like it's got a lot of issues in terms of like how it represents certain, you know, people or whatever. But at the time, as a freshman in high school when this game dropped, I was like not aware of that kind of stuff. I was also like a teenager. I just hadn't really developed those, you know, that sense of empathy quite just yet. Mm-hmm. But there is something to be said about how just cartoony and vibrant this world was. It almost felt like you were playing inside of a cartoon. I think that's one thing that I miss about the GTA series is how, like, I mean, look at this scene right here with this rock star guy and how the way they're dressed, and everything just feels like it's almost like, I don't know, this sort of blend of South Park or The Simpsons or something of that era that was very much poking fun at, you know, capital S society. So yeah, I miss a lot of that stuff in the sort of race to make everything hyper realistic and, you know, include ray tracing or whatever the hell it is. I miss that. I miss those very like intentional decisions, because these at the time this you know, you could argue this looked realistic, but everything still had the colors, the neon colors, and the interesting techniques they were using with, you know, the lights streaking a certain way or whatever. It just felt like this alternate dimension almost.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's a fully stylized world, right?
Yeah.
In like every sense of that word. And as anyone who works in any kind of design can say, right, when you start stylizing things, right, all the rough edges fall off. And so, you know, stereotypes and things like that just play better and easier, right?
Sure.
And so it ends up making that world feel I don't know, more. I guess the stylization in some ways makes the world feel more coherent, right? I think you're right that there's this kind of like cartoon universe where cartoons are running into cartoons, and that's like perfectly cool and feels good. And I do think that there's something lost. I think the transition between like this era and the gritty seriousness or something close to it of Grand Theft Auto 5 is that they tried to put the cartoons in, you know, the real world, right? It's like this terrible it's the same operation, I guess, as Who Framed Roger Rabbit, right? These stereotypes of stock characters from crime dramas or whatever, right, get placed into quote unquote real situations with the same kind of cartoonish writing to it, and it just doesn't work, right? Like when Grand Theft Auto 5 came out, you know, I was like a staunch critic of it, and I had lots of things to say about it. And I think, you know, all these years later, my general feeling about it is just like it doesn't work. It doesn't understand what makes Grand Theft Auto work, even at its worst. Because, you know, as this episode started, and as I think we'll go back to in just a minute, or no, maybe it's finished. But, you know, there's a whole segment in the middle of this game that's the Cubans versus the Haitians, right? And these are just stereotypes, right? Like broad, deeply offensive stereotypes, if you take them seriously, right? And the game has no interest in like making them anything other than that. And you kind of have to just engage with it at face value. You don't have to take it, obviously, right? But you have to engage with it in that way. But if that were in Grand Theft Auto 5, there would be like all kinds of narrative justification for why these people are stereotypes. And that to me feels so much worse.
For sure. I also remember even at the time, the uproar that it caused. Like I remember, I mean, it's weird to say his name. I'm even like hesitant to summon him in any way, but I remember and during that time, like Jack Thompson was a big name because he was going after every game and he was suing every company. And you know, there was a real kind of big debate around, you know, what are we exposing our kids to? Oh no. And, but I knew even back then in 2002 as a again, freshman in high school, as someone who was, you know, in a lot of ways still very, I would say like mentally not, just fully aware of the world. And I hadn't really met all the people I've now met, you know what I mean? Like I hadn't really grown as a person, but even then I knew that like, this was all like clearly a joke. This was all clearly, you know, as offensive as it was, I still knew that like this was all, you know, can I curse on this? Is that okay?
You can do whatever you want.
It was all bullshit. It was all just like an excuse to have fun and you know, be ridiculous and tell these really wacky stories of mobsters who are like all idiots and, you know, just laugh at it, point and laugh. But it, you know, a lot of it does make you wince now for sure. It definitely does for me. But again, like even these missions where you're dealing with these rock stars and stuff, it felt like back then there was almost this, I don't know, it almost felt like a more, I can't really describe it, but it just felt more like it was willing to make fun of itself a lot more in ways that I think the series has kind of lost. And I think GTA 4 for me was like the moment where I started to realize like, oh, you know what? Like I still like these games. I still think they're kind of fun, but they're kind of losing me a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something. I mean, I just don't think that video games. I think they have to be too serious now, right? I think there's too much money involved. I think there's too much investment in like serious narrative, and you know, and I think that we can like, you know, debate whether, you know, even these games were super successful at it. But I mean, I think I was in the same situation as you, in the sense that like when I played these games as a teenager, I was like, this is goofy. Like these dudes are idiots. They are wrong, right? Like these people are not good people to be emulated, right? It's kind of like the way that the Twitter you know, debates about Martin Scorsese films go, right? Like, you know, you know, the people who make those arguments don't seem to really be paying much attention to the people who are in Scorsese films and what happened to them. But you know, but it feels like now, right, even in the most like quote unquote satirical games that exist, that there's not a lot of room for just out and out buffoonery.
Yeah.
Which is maybe unfortunate. I don't know. On the other hand, I guess I really don't want to see anyone in the year 2020 make a game like Vice City, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we kind of are in a weird way, like in a very strange, almost, very, for lack of a better term, like kind of dystopian way. We are kind of seeing a descendant of that game kind of come out around this time, especially this week, that I shall not name again. That also has really problematic depictions of gangs and certain ethnic groups and stuff like that. So it sucks that we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues that this game kind of has brought up, but it's hard to deny how, like, especially for me personally, how impactful this game was to me, because me and my brother, we grew up playing games. Our father introduced us. He was the one who started off as a gamer. He had an Atari 2600 that I remember fondly growing up playing. He had gotten the NES for my older sister, and we just kind of got everything from them, like just hand-me-down stuff, and the rest is history. Like we've played games since we can remember. So Vice City for us was an evolution of what GTA 3 had already introduced, and it felt like way more confident this time around. It took a really big gamble with, like, hey, we're setting this in the past. Like there's going to be things you really can't do, but for the most part, everything else is still intact. And I don't really recall, outside of, again, the driver games, which some of those took place, I think, in the 70s and stuff, which is really cool. I still cape really hard for those games. I think they were massively overlooked and underappreciated. And but this game, in terms of what it did storytelling wise, gameplay wise, with the music, the just all around attention to detail, was mind blowing. Like you couldn't find this, as far as I could tell, maybe outside of, like, I don't know, The Sopranos, but that was a way more intense version of it. You couldn't find this kind of style of farce storytelling anywhere else. So it was like, you knew when this came out, it was an event. Like even me as a freshman in high school, who only got most of his information through video game magazines that came in once a month, which is so wild to think about. Even then I knew, like, oh, this is an event. I want to be here for this. I can't miss this. And me and a lot of my friends were all there for it. And we would just, like, there was also this culture of, even playing these silly races with bikers and stuff. Like, we would just sit around and watch each other. Very nice, Cam. Very nice.
This is one of the hardest missions in this video game, just straight up. Yeah. And I failed it probably 5 or 6 times. I included that immediate bail because I thought that was good. Yeah. But this is a successful run. And
nice.
I appreciate you making me call myself out here.
But no, this is so fun to watch.
But yeah,
though.
These missions are hard as hell. There's some, like, very difficult stuff in here. But I'm sorry, you were talking about kind of the event of Vice City.
Yeah, but, like, I mean, we just kind of did it right now. Like there was a real joy in playing this game with a couple buddies around, like, a tube TV, just, like, passing the controller around, and also somehow memorizing like 3 pages worth of codes, that some of which I might even still remember if I just had enough time to just stare at a wall. It was this thing. It was like this shared experience that existed long before Twitch and YouTube, and it was kind of like the foundation of that kind of stuff. And these games are just so fun to watch people play. Yeah,
a couple years ago, maybe more than a couple years ago now, I did a Let's Play of Grand Theft Auto 3, and I got to, like, the last couple missions, which are also extremely difficult, and I was like, look, I'm just cheating my way through this. like I'm just going to, like, halfway through this mission, bump up my armor, to refill my armor one time, and I'll be good. And I looked at the code, like, one time for it, to do that, and I immediately could do all the finger presses, like L1, R1, whatever, all that stuff. I could input that code almost perfectly again. So yeah, there's something about not just, like, the shared experience in a general sense, because I think we still have these kind of shared experience things around big releases to some extent, but the idea of, like, I'm going to get, a magazine 6 months before that's, like, the big cover story, and then I'm going to get the magazine that month with, like, the 4-page review. and then I'll buy the game and kind of in a similar spot to you, right? Like when a game came out that was really big that I wanted to play, I was able generally to get that game. You know, that's something I would save up for, or you know, especially since it was around the holiday, you know, generally for these releases, you know, I could get that for the holiday, but that was kind of like the game I had. So, you know, Grand Theft Auto 3 and Grand Theft Auto Vice City were both that kind of thing for me. But that's all you had, right? Like you had these magazines and they would often have these like cheat codes in them. And sometimes they would have like some walkthroughs for the hardest missions, or you know, a couple like really difficult things, or like some starting guides or things like that. And then it's like just pure experimentation, right? You're like playing through this game, and some of these missions, as I've been playing through this, you were talking about that RC copter mission. I mean, that was one of them. That, thankfully, though, with the PC version, you can use a mouse as well, and that like really changes how that mission works. But like, there have been several missions like that motorcycle mission I just did, where as soon as it started, I was like, oh no. Like, oh shit, like I'm going to be doing this for the next 40 minutes, just trying to like optimize my movements, because this AI is way better than it should be doing this. But yeah, there's like I have some pretty intense like sense memory of like where I was when I did these things for the first time, and like how long it took me to do them.
No, it was a thing of like, I mean, for me, in my case, it was like, this is the only game I want to play. This is the only game I am going to play for the next, you know, several months. And it was a lot of what we're seeing on screen now. A lot of it was, all right, you know what? The shit hit the fan. I'm just going to see how far I can push this and see what the limits are. And I think one thing that I miss, especially from this era of games, I think once we introduce like achievements and penalizing folks for playing the way that they wanted to play, and there's always going to be like a discussion around, oh yeah, you got to go for the snipe. This is pro moves right here. There's always going to be the discussion around like, oh, like difficulty and what the developer intent was, or whatever the heck the discussion is going to be around. But I do think there is this kind of level of freedom that these games gave me at the time. So close to the hideout there. But like punching in codes and kind of poking and prodding at this thing on your terms was a thing that I didn't feel guilty about at the time. And, you know, now if I'm like, oh man, I got to bump it to easy for this boss, I feel like gross about it. And that's just like a personal hang up. You know, I know there are folks out there. Sorry for all the honking in the background.
That's all
right. It was, there we go. This guy agrees with me. This is going to happen for the next minute or so. I apologize.
That's okay.
This is Brooklyn for you.
Yeah, it's the authentic experience.
Right. This is where GTA 3 took place, baby.
I mean, speaking of kind of the experimentation stuff too, right? Like, not so much in this game, because I don't think I had quite as much time in Grand Theft Auto Vice City as I did in Grand Theft Auto 3, but in Grand Theft Auto 3, I can like remember exactly where to go and like how to stack up ambulances in order to get on top of the hospital roof to like jump into quote unquote blue hell and like all of that stuff, right? Like just a huge amount of weird experimentation to functionally just, you know, be engaging with weird glitches, right? These are not intentional design in any way. But you know, there's very little other than like purposefully searching for those things now and like, you know, hammering a character into a wall over and over and over again to like, you know, move through it at an angle. I feel like, I don't have that experience of like the weird corners of a game world anymore. And that probably has to do too with just the way the tools have changed and the way that these things are produced. I mean, you know, there's entire huge teams of people putting them together, as opposed to, unfortunately, 2 or 3 people just absolutely crunching this thing out over the course of a year. I mean, the idea that there was only a year between Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City is bewildering.
That's wild.
Yeah. It could not have been healthy. And unfortunately, so I've like across several different Range Touch podcasts kind of talked bad about this book a little bit, and I don't mean to, but there's a Jared Kushner book. No, wait, not Jared Kushner.
Oh gosh,
not Jared Kushner. Gosh, what's the dude's name? David Kushner. Hopefully not related.
Sorry, by the way, this is going on outside my window for the past like couple minutes. I've had to mute my mic. So if I'm not as responsive, I'm just waiting for someone who's double parked to just go on with their lives.
Oof,
Sorry about that.
Oof.
Yeah.
You can't.
New York, baby.
Yeah, you can't block the road.
Nah. I mean, you can here. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, baby.
If you can double park there, you can double park anywhere.
That's right.
But yeah, so David Kushner wrote this book, Jack, the Outlaw Story of Grand Theft Auto, which, I mean, you might like, actually, if you're interested in it, Paul, because it basically bounces back and forth between a history of Grand Theft Auto and then a history of Jack Thompson, with a bunch of interviews from when the book came out. The book came out maybe in like 2012 or something like that. 2012.
What's the book called again?
Jacked, the Outlaw Story of Grand Theft
Jacked.
Auto. And so it's interesting to read like what Jack Thompson's up to, and like, you know, how his life has panned out after this, and how he really did not seem to care very much about what he was doing. It seemed like more of a publicity thing. But
oh yeah, it came off that way. Even for my teenage brain, I was like, this guy just, I mean, this was a clout chaser before that term even really existed.
But anyway, the disappointing part of the book for me was that we really don't, there's not a lot of game devy kind of stories in it. And the reason for that is I don't think he could get access to Rockstar. Like, people wouldn't talk to him, and so it's a pretty limited book. But even the things that are interesting about that book is just figuring out that, like, oh, this was a team of like people in the UK just making a game based on ideas they had about a culture and a time all the way around the world, and, you know, 20 years beforehand. And
wow.
It's an interesting book, but unfortunately, that was all to say. Unfortunately, not a lot of cool game dev stories in it.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes off that way. Like, anytime you play a game like this, and you learn later that, like, yeah, the devs were not from surprisingly enough, not from Miami. It does kind of, like, you do get a lot of that flavor of, like, wow, they really loved Miami Vice. They really liked Phil Collins. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, at the time, that kind of pop culture stuff. And I mean, to the extent where Lance Vance is Tubbs. It's the actor who played Tubbs on Miami
really?
Vice.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so like even those kind of nods and winks to the audience, to the players, were like, hey, we did our homework. You know, this isn't just like a, you know, I mean, Ray Liotta was just the very obvious version of that, but yeah, it was cool to have that level of kind of, you know, in a weird way, fan service for people who were, because the 80s at that point in 2002 wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
Now in 2020 it is. Like, now it's like, I think of that meme where people were like, you know, what I think Final Fantasy was like 20 years ago and what it actually was like, and it's like a screenshot of Final Fantasy X, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm so old. So yeah, it was still so fresh in everybody's minds, which I think helped for sure.
That I included this mission failure, by the way, so you could see a beautiful moment of early 2000s game design in which my back tire was shot out, and so I just couldn't complete the mission. I couldn't leave that area, so my only option was to die.
And then take a cab all the way back and watch the cutscene over, skip through it, hopefully.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You got to hammer on that button to skip through that. But that's the kind of rough edge too that we're talking about here. That, you know, there's something about that. Speaking too of the 1980s, I don't know, authenticity vibes or whatever. Something that I didn't remember about this game until replaying it again was that once you get to, I think, Wanted level 4, like Tubbs and Crockett start coming after you.
What?
Did you remember that?
Somehow I did not know that.
Yeah,
no.
So it's like two dudes in like a sports car with a
actually I do remember
little,
this.
you know, whatever those things, a siren in the front of it. Yeah, and they just start coming after you, and you can, like, you know, steal their car instead of a cop car. If you want.
It's great.
Yeah, it's like a little touch
that.
where like that's, you know, 100%. I don't know, like, you know, someone ripping something off in pop culture, but it really working. Really cool, I think.
That is really cool. I somehow forgot about that altogether, but I do very distinctly remember what car they drove in the game, because, like, it was one of my favorite cars in the game. I think it was like was it like a cheetah or something? I forget what they were called.
Something like that. They all have weird knockoff names.
Yeah. Also, like, I think I wouldn't be able to talk about this game without talking about, we talked a little bit about it, but like the radio DJs and the advertisements in particular are like genuinely like some really funny stuff. Like you can, I mean, a lot of it is still kind of like, again, you wince at it now, but it still kind of holds up. Like some of the stuff I was playing even yesterday, like there was this weird thing that they were selling called like giggle cream or something like that. That was basically just like, I don't know, probably just alcohol or something. But it's just really funny. It's just like really funny to also now, especially tune into, Fernando or what is it? Like not Chatterbox, but there was like was it Chatterbox?
Yeah,
was that the name of the show? Yeah. Just some of that stuff is like really interesting to listen to now, because back then, I mean, also again, this was, I mean, I don't know if podcasts existed yet.
No.
I mean, radio certainly did, but these were podcasts. These were like recorded things that you would drive around listening to. And granted, it was all scripted and meant to be funny and nonsense. But yeah, it's this game. I could talk about this game for hours, man. I love this game so much.
Yeah, there's something. The other ad I like a lot is the Degenitron, which is
oh my god, yeah,
a video game system that just makes your children. I mean, it's literally, I mean, it's satirizing what people said about Grand Theft Auto, which I think is pretty great. And then they put it back, 20 years in the past. As like a weird. There's a billboard of it somewhere in the game. I forget where, but it's like basically it looks exactly like an Intellivision.
That's great. I love it.
But yeah, no, I mean there has been something special about playing this game again that I didn't feel when I played Grand Theft Auto 3 necessarily. I think Grand Theft Auto 3 probably in a general sense, like gameplay and like map wise and things like that, there's a lot less like rough gameplay edges to it. I think it's easier for someone to be handed it and just kind of like go wild with it in the year 2020. This game has a lot more buttons and a lot more like weird things like weapon types, as if that was something that needed to be implemented in the game. But and so I think it's a little bit more confusing, but yeah, still kind of, I mean, it still works, obviously.
Totally.
And it had motorcycles, which the previous game did not, and that was huge for me.
Yeah, it also had Rick James in it. So I mean, what else do you really need,
Exactly. Well, we're getting close to the end of the episode here. So, Paul, where can people find you on the internet?
So you can find me on Twitter and Twitch, where I stream pretty much every day, Monday through Friday, at Polimayo, P-O-L-I-M as in Mario, A-Y-O. Shoot me a follow, say what's up. And I'm looking forward to this dropping so I can send it to my brother and be like, hey, look, man. Hey, George, we made it.
We talked about the game that we played as children.
Remember this, yo? But no, seriously, thank you for having me. This was a really good time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. And we'll be back with the next episode of the Vice City Let's Play.